right, good afternoon, everyone. I know some of us are settling down, so just judging by the turnout, I'm confident that this is going to be a great seminar.
Pressure's high.
Yeah. So today I'm very fortunate to have Dr. Lindsay Young. She's a K99 postdoctoral scholar, and she's actually from the University of Chicago Department of Medicine, but I think they're physically here in LA.
Physically here, yeah. Let's say a little bit of it.
Yeah, so the title of her talk is really interesting. It's Networks and Artificial Intelligence. So who's heard of artificial intelligence? I think all of us, right? And I think more often than not, we don't realize the application of artificial intelligence in our day-to-day lives, whether we're using Google for maps or anything else that we do on a daily basis. So she's going to be presenting computational partners in the study of HIV prevention and risk online. So, welcoming Dr. Lindsay Young. And if you guys have questions, we'll go till about 3, but I would encourage just an informal discussion and ask questions along the way.
Please do. Yeah.
Dr. Young.
Thank you. Okay, so I just want to thank you as a community for welcoming me. As Jay explained, I'm a postdoc scholar, technically affiliated with the University of Chicago, and a recent K99 awardee. And for the last several years, I've been working with Dr. John Schneider in the Department of Medicine at the University of Chicago, where our work primarily focuses on trying to understand the social network dynamics of HIV risk and prevention, but also trying to understand how we can leverage them for intervention opportunities. So that said, I also do currently live here in Los Angeles, and I'm really eager to kind of grow my network out here. So thank you again for granting me this opportunity. So today I want to walk you through a program of research that I've been kind of fleshing out over the last several years, which is now the foundation of my K99 award. So in a nutshell, my work aims to investigate and explore how HIV prevention and risk manifests in the online social networks of young MSM of color, specifically young Black MSM who live in Chicago. It's kind of the data set that I'm working with. However, as you can kind of imagine when thinking about social media, parsing these kind of complex data into really tractable insights and intervention opportunities requires a really innovative and kind of flexible toolkit that extends beyond kind of traditional statistical approaches. So today I'd like to talk about my work through the lens of the social network and AI approaches, machine learning approaches that I have and will use to explore this data space over the next 4 more years of this award. So the rest of my talk will be organized as follows. First, I'll just briefly provide a literal snapshot of what motivates my work. Next, I'll elaborate on the network perspective itself to establish the types of inquiries that motivate my work. Then I'll talk about social media as this kind of new network repository where we can learn about the behaviors and the social lives of young sexual minorities. And then I'll introduce my K99 aims and highlight some of the methods that I'm using to explore those aims. And finally, if any time allows, which it probably won't, it's fine, I'll briefly introduce a next step in kind of my research trajectory.
You should start with the future directions.
Yeah, I know, because I never get to that, right? Okay, so unlike other similar talks that I have given in the past, where the audiences may be less familiar with HIV, they might just be public health general audiences, or perhaps they're more social scientists. Today I'm going to forego the tutorial on what HIV currently looks like in the United States, and instead I'll just allow this picture to kind of speak to the crux of the problem. So we know that Black MSM bear the heaviest burden of HIV incidence in the United States, and we know that they have less engagement in critical prevention and treatment modalities of care than their white counterparts. And so this is what motivates my work. So the mechanisms behind these disparities are not exactly well understood. I'm sure we're all familiar with kind of these meta-analyses that have come out of largely kind of Millet's and colleagues' work that have found things like Black MSM tend to report less substance use and fewer partners than white MSM, 2 critical kind of risk factors. No significant differences by race in reported risk behaviors like condomless sex, commercial sex work, or sex with a known HIV-positive partner. And so these findings kind of force us to contend or acknowledge with the fact that individual behaviors do not adequately explain the differences in HIV incidence between white and Black MSM. Instead, factors like partner characteristics, peer influence, social norms, stigma and discrimination, and social support are kind of gaining steam and being discussed and studied as kind of critical mechanisms to help us understand how and why risk kind of manifests in these communities. And together, these factors kind of bring our attention to the role of networks, both in facilitating the transmission of HIV, as in the case of sexual networks, which there's a lot of really great work and groups of scholars that kind of focus on the sexual networks, but more to the point of my research is that networks play a role in kind of exposing people to their peers' HIV risks and protective behaviors, and in influencing behavioral decisions. And so we kind of generally refer to this as the social network perspective. So in summary, a network perspective on HIV risk allows us to ask, questions like how are the people you know and interact with, the things that you talk about, and the attributes of your networks, how are they related to HIV-related knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors? So now what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the opportunity that we have to seek answers to questions like this with digitally archived social media data. And specifically, just to kind of put it out there up front, my work focuses on Facebook data, but I will talk a little bit about why we're specifically focusing on Facebook data. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with kind of how social media or social network data are typically collected, I'm going to kind of take you down, an historical path. But this is kind of important, and it gets to the point of why social media data is enticing. So, many of you are actually quite young in this room, so it may come as a surprise that a long time ago, when we talked about collecting information, and I'm older than most of you actually too, so when we talked about collecting information about people's relationships and social environments, what we were really talking about looked something like this. So a researcher's observations of subjects' interactions, in-person interviews, or some kind of paper-administered survey, right? And the thing is that these methods are still actually widely used in research, and there's nothing wrong, and there's reasons for using some of these methods. But there are a lot of challenges to this kind of data collection. So obviously this is incredibly resource intensive. There's a lot of participant fatigue in filling out these surveys. And trust me, participants quickly catch on that they're going to have to answer a bunch of questions about all these people that they name, so they stop naming people. That's something we deal with all the time. Reporting biases, so only kind of reporting people in their social network that they saw or met up with recently, for example. And of course, all kinds of missing data. So on the other hand, and kind of now what's really exciting is that we have this kind of phenomena of social media. So widespread use of social media has now introduced this kind of alternative repository of network data with immense potential, I think, for providing insights about the social lives of young MSM and how those features might relate to their HIV-related behaviors. And this optimism comes from awareness that young sexual and gender minorities haven't even found to use social media more than their heterosexual counterparts. And in my view, I think in some ways that they're using it precisely to explore their sexual and gender identities and to find and kind of build community. And this can be really hard for them to do offline. So not only does social media just provide an alternative source of social network data, it might actually provide us with a glimpse into their lives that we might not get just from talking to people and kind of studying their offline networks. Okay, but which platform is best? Okay, so there's a sea of social media applications out there, and it's very tempting to just want to either use all of them or kind of focus on the ones that are hot right now, so things like Snapchat. And certainly all of these platforms could provide some kind of insight about the interests and social lives of its users, but they're not equally relevant to the task at hand. So for example, remember my primary interest, and most of your primary interest, is to learn about the routine interactions and communication among young MSM and their peers and how that relates to their engagement in prevention and risk behaviors. So there are several factors that I would want to consider when deciding which platform is best suited to this task. So the first thing to consider is capture. So does a majority of the targeted population use the platform with enough frequency? And this gets to when you're kind of planning these studies, is to do this early work, survey people, find out where they have active profiles, how often they use those. And so So this is incredibly important because Snapchat might be really popular, but you might find that that might only be kind of a niche community within your larger targeted population, so it's not going to be as relevant. Two, you want to think about the purpose of the social media platform. So what types of content are being generated and shared among users? Certainly LinkedIn is not going to be extremely relevant to, it's not going to provide the content that I'm primarily interested in. And to be honest, nor might Instagram is primarily photos. I mean, there's content being produced, but if you don't have the capability to actually analyze the photos, that might not be as relevant for you. And finally, I think the most important thing, but the thing that doesn't get discussed very often, is feasibility. So how easy or hard is it to actually obtain the data that you're looking for? So certainly with things like, you see a lot of studies now kind of utilizing Twitter, and maybe their question that they're asking is kind of how information about health spreads in this kind of environment. Twitter's also very popular because there's an open API, and it's relatively easy to kind of capture that data and scrape it and kind of construct a network based on hashtags and things like that. Facebook used to be much easier because they would allow third parties to kind of scrape data, develop third-party apps. They've curtailed that, but they still have this kind of very clean manual download process, which can be easily incorporated to other forms of data collection when you're studying populations. You can imagine surveying a population, you go through the consent process, and you can kind of easily kind of build in the Facebook download as just part of that data collection process. So for me, as I'm kind of alluding to, for me and my team at the University of Chicago, we still find that Facebook is the most viable platform for us to utilize and to study. And so this is why we have focused on several of our studies in collecting Facebook data from this kind of large cohort that we focus on. Okay, so the other added advantage to using something like Facebook is that it offers us a nice parallel to how peer relationships are structured in the offline world, right? So like real-world peer contexts, online peer networks are multidimensional. They have kind of multiple ways in which individuals can interact. And so you have person-to-person friendships, you have person-to-group affiliations or person-to-event affiliations, and then you obviously have kind of person-to-person communication, or at the very least, you have person-to-public communication, right? You have all that kind of timeline content that you can look at. So it's kind of nice that it provides us with these parallels that we know that exist offline. We know that young adolescents belong to sports teams and clubs and things like that, and those studies have kind of been done, and we can kind of do similar things with Facebook. Okay. So, as if it's not already obvious, things like the friendship ties and the group affiliation ties would be kind of the direct and mediated structural pathways through which things like peer influence and behavioral exposure could occur. So these would be the ties of various types of networks. And then the communication content would be kind of tells us more about the personal and shared interests of the peers, their norms, their propensity to engage in certain types of behaviors. And I think together, Facebook's kind of multidimensionality with its structure and the communication features offer researchers a really rich landscape to explore the network mechanisms of HIV risk. All right, so now I'm going to illustrate how a toolkit of computational techniques, including social network analysis, which is more of my wheelhouse, semantic network analysis, and then machine learning approaches for textual analysis and predictive modeling can be applied to this landscape through the lens of my K99 award. I'm assuming that most of you know what a K99 is. It's a career development award, kind of has two phases. The first phase is continued postdoc support, and then it's meant to help you transition into an independent faculty position. So the research that I am presenting here is meant to span both of those phases, so it's kind of like a 5-year trajectory. Okay. So specifically, the project's other aims are to do 3 things. First, I want to examine the relationship between Facebook friendship ties and group affiliation ties and the HIV prevention and care and risk kind of engagement behaviors of young MSM. So more to the point, I'm interested in understanding how HIV-related behaviors of Facebook users informs their formation of friendship ties and group affiliation ties. this is kind of an awkwardly phrased aim. The second aim is to characterize kind of the communication content, right? So to characterize the semantic features of the Facebook communication and explore their associations with the various HIV-related behaviors of young MSM. And then finally, I want to kind of try to utilize information that we can kind of pull from both of these aims to see if we can actually predict future HIV prevention care engagement as a function of Facebook engagement patterns. And I'll get to kind of why we would even want to do that in the first place, other than that it sounds cool. Okay, so to these ends, I'm going to draw on data that's collected from 423 young Black MSM who are part of a larger cohort that we kind of study and who are involved in our various studies. And these are young Black MSM aged 18 to 35 who live in Chicago. And most of these individuals come from a parent study called PrEP Chicago, which is an NIH-funded RCT prevention intervention that is almost done now, and it's been something that I've been a part of for the last 4 years. In terms of the data that we'll be utilizing, so first, the first set of data obviously come from Facebook. So we have Facebook networks and the communication content. We capture, and these are the 3 types of information that we capture from all of the participants in the study, which is in the manual download, we can obtain their Facebook friendships, a list of the Facebook groups that they belong to, and then their timeline posts from the previous 12 months. So we're not collecting everything, but you can kind of establish a time frame for how much you're looking at. And so all of these pieces of information are at the individual level, and then with these 2 things that create the networks, we kind of have to aggregate them and do some matching work. Some more information are going to be pulled from EMRs. So specifically, and we haven't even started this process yet, but through releases of information, we have access to EMR data from our participants. And so we're hoping that we can get slightly better information about like retention and care, so whether they're kind of have primary care, PrEP care for the few that are actually on PrEP, as well as HIV care. There's actually a significant portion of this sample that is HIV positive. And then things like kind of recent STI, HIV testing. We also collect this data through self-reports and surveys, but we're kind of hoping to see if we can get slightly better data. And then finally, we do a lot of surveys, and so in the surveys and kind of risk assessments that are attached to the blood draws, because we do blood draws as well, all kinds of information about sexual risk behaviors, so things like condomless sex, sex drug use, exchange sex, and others, and then information about structural vulnerabilities, so things like housing instability, criminal justice involvement, financial stability, things like that.
Question?
Yeah.
It's when you started talking about the AIDS, I was thinking, where's the data coming from? And then you answered that. But how did you consent? People just agreed to let you download their Facebook stuff?
Yeah, surprisingly, we actually have had very little problem. I think we've had maybe 3 people who have refused, and they are still part of the eligibility criteria is that they have an active profile on Facebook, because the intervention from the parent study, there's a Facebook component. It's not entirely conducted online, but there's a Facebook component. So we're assured kind of at the onset that they at least have an active profile on Facebook. And then, yes, through the consent process, built into the consent process, and we're very careful about walking them through, so that they fully understand.
They release the medical records?
Yeah. I mean, I know, it's amazing and astounding to me, and those questions actually should go to John, because he's kind of been doing this for a long time, and I think he's built a very close relationship with IRB, and they understand his work, and our guys are surprisingly open about sharing this information. We're very clear that these are the only 3 pieces of information that we're capturing. So there's a lot of, you can get a lot of access to people's personal information, phone, all kinds of stuff. Private messages we're specifically not downloading. I think we'd have a little bit more resistance if we were trying to go for the DMs. Because it's a manual download, they literally are present with us when they go to the computer, log into their Facebook account, go through the download. They select which pieces of information are going to be downloaded. And so it's very clear to them that we're not getting all this other stuff and we're only getting these 3 things. I think it's just a credit of the process, and we've kind of honed it, and it seems to work well for us. IRB relationship is also a very important thing in this.
So Lindsay, the
Yeah.
Facebook download, so you mentioned there's a cap on how many months you would go far back.
You can actually download everything. That would just
upon
take
their consent.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, upon their consent.
Right.
We build in that it's only for the previous 12 months. So we
Okay, got it.
there's a place for you to establish what your timeline frame is.
And then in terms of periodic download, looking at the HIV risk factors you're
Mhm.
capturing, I'm assuming, is it like a one-time thing or ongoing?
No, yeah, so, yeah, not on the slide
Mhm.
so thank you for reminding me, is that we collect all of these data
Right.
at baseline, 12 months, and
Gotcha.
24 months.
Okay.
So we actually we're just finishing up our 24 months, and as you can imagine, we have some kind of retention issues, so like the numbers are getting smaller.
Mhm.
But I think we're hovering still at about like 70 to 75%, which takes dogged determination at 24 months. So yeah, but ultimately, right now I have complete baseline and 12-month data, and then eventually I'll have 24-month data.
Thanks.
Yeah, and as I'll show briefly, I will be doing some longitudinal stuff with this. Okay, so the first aim, if you remember, is to, and I should actually back up. I think as public health researchers, most of us are accustomed to seeing like a kind of regression model that has kind of a health outcome that we're looking at, probably a logistic regression model, because it seems to be our favorite. It's definitely my favorite. It's easiest. They do something or they don't do something. They get tested or not, right? And if there's social network factors, covariates in those models, they'll just be they might be like their position in the network or something like that. And so I think that's what most people are kind of accustomed to seeing, and that's kind of the wheelhouse of public health research. This aim and this research question kind of flips things on its head. So while there's no way that I can assign causality to this, what I'm really interested in is the formation of a tie as the outcome. So I'm really interested in how networks emerge. So the Facebook friendship networks and the group affiliation networks. And I'm interested in understanding how the attributes of young Black MSM, specifically their HIV-related behaviors, kind of inform the formation of those ties. And this is because I'm really interested in kind of how norms emerge in social spaces, and so you can start to understand how if you find kind of clusters of people with similar behaviors in a network, and you know that this happens above and beyond, chance alone, that these might be places and the types of people that we should intervene with, because there's the potential for kind of behavioral norms to emerge because they're interacting with each other all the time. Okay, so to do this, to kind of do this modeling, I'm going to be utilizing, I am currently utilizing, and will be utilizing this one, two kind of modeling workhorses in the networks community. And this is exponential random graph models, which is a mouthful. We call these ergoms. And then stochastic actor-oriented models, or SOMs, but we also refer to them as Sienna models because that's the software that we typically use to do this. This allows us to do some longitudinal work. But I'm going to spend most of my time talking about the ergoms because that's where I've done most of the work so far. So what is an ergom? Ergoms are a class of statistical models that help us understand, ultimately, how and why network ties emerge. So you can think of this, because the tie is the outcome that we're looking at, the presence or absence of a tie, as kind of in the same logic of a logistic regression, right? We have kind of a yes or no binary outcome that we're interested in. But this is where it gets a little bit different. So what they do, they model the likelihood of local configurations in the network. So let's just say that this is our network. And what I mean by local configurations are these kind of smaller patterns that exist in the network. And I'll explain what these are in a moment. So they do this by modeling the likelihood of these local configurations or network motifs. And this is another way of saying that they determine whether these configurations occur more often than would be expected by chance alone. Now, why are these configurations even important in the first place? And that's because these configurations are ultimately important because they represent distinct social processes. So for example, triangles right here, sorry, things are a little bit off, but triangles represent social balance, which is this tendency to form friendships with the friends of our friends, for example, if we're looking at a friendship network, right? And this is a very common phenomena that has been identified in all kinds of studies of friendship networks, right? We know that this happens. And of course, this is what Facebook wants us to do, because they send us like, hey, you should be friends with this person because you have a friend who's also a friend with this person. On the other hand, like you might also have a star configuration where you have someone who's like very popular in that configuration. And this is what happens, we call this preferential attachment, where you can imagine going into a room full of people you don't know, but everyone else kind of knows each other, and you notice that there's certain people who are popular, and so you go over and you befriend that person because they're attracting a lot of attention. So these are the stars in the network, or hubs. So again, the selection of which configurations to include in your model ultimately corresponds to the actual theories of social interaction that you want to test. Okay, so these configurations that I just described can be endogenous, which means that they emerge from connections that actors make in response to other ties in their social environment. So for example, if we're looking at these triangles, this would be, and if we found that these were occurring more often than chance alone, we would be able to say that young black MSM are more likely to become Facebook friends with the friends of their friends, okay? So they're just responding to what's happening inside the network, the endogeneity. But configurations can also be exogenous. And this means that ties can emerge in response to properties that exist outside of the network, like the attributes of the network members. So this is really what I'm interested in, right? Because remember, I want to see how prevention and risk engagement behaviors kind of inform their formation of ties. So again, that we might be looking at a network of young MSM, and we kind of we know what social scenes they belong to. So we might find that the club kids in the star up there tend to be popular, or we might find that young black MSM who belong to the ballroom community are more likely, they tend to be Facebook friends with one another. So that's a phenomenon we call homophily, where people with the same trait, or sortativity, right, kind of get together and are friends. Now, if that's not enough, ergoms there's kind of three forms of ergoms that I plan to utilize. So you have one-mode ergoms, which are meant for networks that have one type of node, and so that would be like the Facebook friendship network. You just have young black MSM who are friends with one another. And here edges can be directed. If you're looking at a network like of information spread, where it starts from one person and goes to the next, there's like a direction there. Or it could be undirected, which is essentially what we're working with Facebook friendship ties. Technically, there's information about maybe who initiated the tie, but we're just kind of looking at it as a thing that already exists, and there's no kind of direction between the two. Arrogance can also be for two-mode networks, which means you have two types of actors in the network. And this might be, this is an old example, but this would be young black MSM and Facebook groups, okay? Now with these models, as you can see from the graph to your right, the ties that you're modeling are only exist between the two types of nodes. So a tie exists between a young black MSM and a Facebook group, indicating like a membership tie. You are not modeling ties that exist between individuals or between groups, okay? So this is specifically meant to model these between node type ties. And then finally, there's multiplex ergoms, which allow you to model one and two mode networks in the context of one another. And this is really kind of specifically interesting and important, I think, for thinking about social media environments or Facebook environments, because you have friendships in Facebook groups, like Facebook affiliations, happening at the same time on top of each other. And you better believe that those two things are informing each other. Like, you're probably, I mean, I haven't actually done this portion of the analysis, but my bet would be that you're more likely to belong to groups with people that you're already friends with, because that's how you're finding out that they even belong to them in the first place. Okay. So, those are the kind of the three types of ergoms that I plan to use. And so now what I would like to do is kind of walk you through two separate two-mode ergom analyses of Facebook group affiliations, one of which has been published in Needs and Behavior, and the other which is now under review at AJPH. just to give you a sense of kind of what the output looks like and kind of how we interpret the findings. So the model, again, that I'm working with is a two-mode ergon of face group affiliations among young Black MSMs. So we have two types of nodes in the network. The question being is, how do the HIV-related attributes of young Black MSM, as well as attributes of groups, which I'll get to in a moment, how do those two things kind of jointly bring structure to their Facebook group affiliations? The attributes of young Black MSM that I'm looking at are kind of self-explanatory. I've already gone through it. So there are HIV-related behaviors, sex behaviors, and certain prevention behaviors. And then in each of these two papers, I looked at different types of group attributes. In the first paper, I looked at the group privacy status. So Facebook groups can either be public, closed, or secret. And that just is a differentiation by how searchable they are and how, whether non-members can see any content. Obviously, secret groups, you can't even search for them. You only know about them if you've been invited to join them. Public groups are completely open. You can see what's being posted, who the members are, without being a member yourself. And then in the second paper, we looked at I looked at the focus or the topical orientation of the groups. And this was a long process of human coding where we took the kind of description provided by the group and the group name to try to derive some kind of sense of what the group is about. And we came up, I think, with 9 or 10 different kind of topics that include things like LGBTQ identity, groups that were just basically cruising sites or sexual attraction sites, general chat groups, a lot of groups that kind of about personal and professional development and social networking, but for professional purposes, groups that are just about recreational interest, etc. And the configurations that I'm ultimately interested in, because remember, these local configurations represent distinct social processes, and there's kind of 3 primary things that I'm looking at. One, I just want to know whether, oh, yeah, it does work. Okay, so here, what I'm looking at is whether young MSM with certain characteristics are simply more likely to belong to Facebook groups, irrespective of the type of Facebook group. Here is kind of an interaction effect. I'm interested in knowing whether young MSM with certain characteristics, say young MSM who engage in common sex, right? Are they more likely to belong to a certain type of Facebook group? Are they more likely to belong to cruising sites? Okay. And then down here, these 2 configurations are essentially variations on kind of clustering behavior. So we can kind of see whether individuals are more, what types of individuals might be more likely to cluster around Facebook groups, and which types of Facebook groups kind of garner that kind of clustering behavior. And so in the first paper where we were looking at the group privacy status, I'm going to quickly just forget this, it's too small to even see. Just focus on what's in the box. So this was the study where we looked at the privacy status. And so with respect to the attribute-based edges, so whether certain types of young MSM are simply more likely to belong to Facebook groups, we find that HIV-positive individuals are more likely to belong to Facebook groups than expected by chance alone. And then individuals who engage in group sex are actually less likely to belong to Facebook groups than expected by chance alone. But that story gets a little bit more interesting in a moment. So then we move on to look at the interactions between characteristics of the individuals and the privacy status of the groups. And we find that HIV-positive individuals, despite being more likely to belong to Facebook groups, are actually less likely to belong to secret groups than public groups. Public groups were kind of the reference. Individuals who engaged in group sex, despite being less likely to belong to Facebook groups in general, when they do belong to them, they're more likely to belong to secret groups. And regular testers, so people who had been tested at least 3 times in the past 9 months, were more likely to belong to closed groups. I don't really know what to make of that. It's kind of a middle ground. And then finally, with respect to these kind of clustering behaviors, we find that individuals who engage in condomless sex were more likely to cluster around a shared set of groups. So irrespective of the type of group, they do cluster around groups. And then we find that HIV-positive individuals, again, despite being more likely to belong to groups, they're actually less likely to share groups in common with one another. And this, I think, has implications for we might want to build these communities for them. I mean, I was hoping that we would find the opposite, right? Where they're kind of in these social spaces online where they're actually kind of sharing in a common group setting, but we actually find that they don't cluster like that.
Question?
Yeah.
It looked like if a person is both HIV positive and engaging in group sex, that those factors might in some ways cancel each other out. There's
yeah, so well, we didn't look at the interactions of young Black MSM's attributes, but
I mean, I was just looking at there's a negative and then there's a positive.
Yeah. So I'm fairly certain, because when I do these models, I typically try to do them iteratively just to see, like, so I can catch that stuff. I want to say that these stayed true when one of them was taken out. Oh yeah, this is one of these touch things. So I want to say that, but I can't say that for sure. But that you're correct to point that out, because that might be the case. Yeah, Ellen.
And for the secret board, do you know the title of it? I forgot if you said that. For the secret groups, do you know what the topic is about at all? Or?
Not for this study. So I didn't include. Yeah. So the next study, instead of looking at privacy, I looked at the topical orientation. What you're getting at is potentially another paper, if I can kind of milk something else out of this, is to potentially try to look at both of those, and maybe not do this complicated model, but to try to just do something even descriptively to say which types of groups tend to be secret, which tend to be public, which tend to be closed, or whatever. Actually, yeah, if you want to help me, you can write a paper. Because that actually, that is something that I should probably do. And then just real quickly, so this is the second paper that's currently under review, and here I was more interested in this way, kind of in thinking about how do groups with the same kind of topical orientation, like do they share young MSM members? So, So here, this is like the clustering term, but instead of looking at whether certain types of individuals tend to cluster around Facebook groups, I'm kind of flipping that around and asking whether whether pairs of Facebook groups with the same topic attract the same members. And so we find that there's significant tendencies for clustering to occur among the network members that occur around pairs of Facebook groups that focus on LGBTQ identity. So if they belong to one, they belong to another. And it's not just one person who kind of has that behavior, it's multiple individuals in the network. And they also do the same thing for sexual attraction groups, so kind of cruising sites, as well as for groups that promote club events. And the club events are primarily all like LGBT, like kind of oriented club events. And then when we looked at some interactions that I included in the model, we find that young MSM who engage in condomless sex and who are regular testers are more likely than expected to belong to LGBTQ identity groups. Young Black MSM who have heard of PrEP are more likely to belong to chat groups, and these are just kind of chat groups that are just generically about anything. And again, I can't assign causality, but there's kind of some interesting things there. And then young Black MSM who are regular testers are also more likely to belong to groups that promote club events. And this actually makes sense because these groups often will have stuff about HIV testing, like advertisements and stuff like that, or like promo kind of things. And they're also kind of tied into the ballroom community, and there's a lot of testing kind of engagement that's been going on for a long time with that community. So it's not surprising to me that we found this. Okay, just real quickly, these Sienna models that I referred to essentially just allow us to kind of take, if we have more than one, we capture the network at more than one time point and behaviors at more than one time point, then there's an opportunity to see how both network change and behavioral change kind of co-evolves. And that's what these models allow us to do. So behaviors can affect future network structure can affect future behavior, and these models essentially stipulate how the network and behavior could have co-evolved over time if you have at least 2 time points. I'm not going to go into any more details with that, but I could certainly try to answer questions if you have them. All right. So I'm going to skip this stuff too because I want to get to the second aim. But just so you know, I have thought about practical implications, and I think there are some practical implications to this kind of complicated modeling. So the second aim focuses on understanding patterns in each participant's timeline posts, and then trying to connect those patterns to their actual behaviors, right? So more specifically, I'm exploring to what extent do young Black MSM even talk about HIV-related issues on Facebook, and I am casting a very wide net when I'm talking about HIV-related issues, and I'll get to that in a moment. 2, what is the underlying structure of that discourse? And 3, to what extent are the features of an individual's communication related to their actual behaviors? So, the first set of methods that I'm going to employ under the same falls under this broad category of automated textual analysis. So, as I mentioned, the texts here come from the timeline posts. So, to determine the extent to which young Black MSM actually talk about HIV-related issues, I have to do kind of 3 things. So first, I'll start by building a search term dictionary of keywords and phrases, and even maybe emojis and things like that, that kind of fall under a series of broader factors that are known to be associated with HIV. So by broad factors, I mean things like sex and relationships, maybe social scenes, partying and substance use, obviously, but other kind of more indirect structural things like, you know, do they talk about being poor and having to pay the bills? So it's things like financial instability or housing instability or exposure to crime, things like that. You can imagine that, in doing some interviews with these individuals, these are things that they do talk about on Facebook. Second, kind of with that data as input, we can kind of build an algorithm that kind of scans the timeline posts and kind of searches and identifies where these words are in these posts. And that's a very oversimplification of that portion of the project. But then kind of once we know which individuals use which words, we can kind of classify individuals into more meaningful categories based on their use and non-use of these key terms using something called latent semantic analysis. Okay, so most critical, I think, to the same is developing a robust dictionary. But this, as you can imagine, isn't an easy task. I'm not sure if anyone's actually taken a look at a young adult's Facebook timeline. But trust me, it's very hard to know what they're even talking about because there's a lot of lingo, slang, colloquialisms, and this is like times 100 when you're working with like young Black MSM, right? Like someone like myself, trust me, has no idea really what they're talking about. Urban Dictionary was like my friend as I was just trying to understand. So to build my dictionary, I'm kind of taking a top-down and bottom-up approach. So the first thing that I need to do is define these categories, and this is the top-down part, right? This is where I just turn to the literature. You think about all these models that we build on an everyday basis, like the everything but the kitchen sink model. You have all these different variables. In our minds, at the very least, we're thinking about the different types of categories that we know that are related to HIV vulnerability. So you have your behavioral factors, your sex behaviors, you have kind of sexual and gender identity, you have maybe things about their partnerships or their relationships, you might, obviously things about their engagement in sexual health, healthcare, mental health, substance use, yes, the structural vulnerabilities, all of these things we tend to see in models. So these are kind of going to be, and this isn't the be-all and end-all list, but this is an example of these broad categories. And then, so once we establish that, we take more of a bottom-up approach. And this is something that I actually, so the idea is to interview members of the young Black MSM community and actually learn how they talk about these issues on social media. And so I just came back from Chicago and just finished a bunch of interviews with some of our superstar participants from the Prep Chicago study, asking them questions like this, right? So what types of substance use behaviors do you see people posting about on social media? So you get them to kind of name things. And then you ask them, okay, so what are some kind of alternative terms or emojis that you see people using to kind of clue people into what you're talking about, right? And so then they go through this entire list of all the code words and slang that are used for, you know, marijuana or cocaine or meth or even just for drinking and getting drunk, right? And so you kind of pick up on all those slang. So I'm now in the process of kind of transcribing these interviews and kind of using this as a basis to kind of start like iteratively building out my dictionary. And so you can imagine you start getting something like this, right? And so you just have, you know, words that are kind of related to these categories. And the idea is that you kind of do this in an iterative fashion, you build it out, You return to the community sources as you need to. So I'll probably go back and do some more concerted kind of focus groups like team effort, what's missing, give me some more synonyms, things like that. But the idea is kind of do this kind of back and forth process to build out the dictionary. And then kind of with that, the idea is to kind of develop this kind of algorithm, and actually just go back here. The idea is to then use this as the input for the algorithm. Now, I'm kind of glossing over how easy or hard it is to do the algorithm part. The search term algorithm is actually pretty basic, but you can imagine that there's all kinds of double meanings with these words. Like, my angel might refer to a partner, but an angel, maybe it should be like an angel over in faith, or like, tea is a word that's used kind of in the ballroom community, like gossip, but they could just be talking about their favorite tea, and that's not really relevant to what I mean. So you need to test this on data that you're not using for the analysis, right? So we actually do have some alternative data sets. See how well the algorithm can pick up on these words. Then bring it back to a small group of human coders and have them verify whether something that was tagged with the word tea in it, whether it is actually the kind of tea that we're interested in. And then you can kind of, if not, you can kind of find ways to try to improve the algorithm so it can differentiate between those two types of things. So this is a very long process. Most of this is going to be done during the R00 phase of my work. But I'm starting to get this dictionary process built. But with that, once the algorithm is run, what you ultimately get is something that kind of looks like this, right? Which is like a matrix of keywords, and you can just pretend that the columns might represent either individuals or individual posts, and the cells are just the number of times a keyword was present in that post or in a small corpus of posts that's connected to an individual. And so what we can do is we can kind of start to so latent semantic analysis is kind of what you use to then try to kind of put people into kind of different buckets based on their similarity in kind of word use, right? And we can kind of then use those buckets, kind of like a principal components analysis or something like that, as like a variable in a model, where we can say these types of people, and we can see whether these types of people are more likely to engage in certain types of behaviors. And this is just a heat map, which is another way to represent what this is doing, which is to say you can kind of see the keywords in the darker cells are more likely to co-occur with one another, and individuals, the same thing with individuals. They're more likely to use the same kinds of words. So you can start to kind of identify meaningful clusters and communities within this larger population. Now, latent semantic analysis is useful for doing this kind of bucketing, but it doesn't really help us understand kind of the real relationships that exist between keywords and individuals. And for this, I think doing more semantic network characterization could be useful and insightful, at least in an exploratory way. So like relationships, text can be analyzed as networks, and the baseline network would be something that looks like this. So you have links between individuals in squares and words in circles, right? So this would be like a two-mode network. But it's actually, this isn't exactly the most useful way to analyze the data, so what would be more heuristically interesting is to convert this two-mode network into a one-mode network of individuals who are linked, where the links between them reflect common term usage. So you can't really analyze what types of terms they're using, but you know that these individuals, like if maybe they share 10 different words, they have a meaningful relationship because they're using shared language. Or you could actually do a one-mode network of keywords, and you can have the ties between keywords representing their their joint co-occurrence in a post, right? So together, what this allows us to do is to kind of identify these more meaningful clusters of keywords or individuals. You can imagine with a network of individuals connected via their shared use of keywords, that we can see how different types of individuals cluster on the basis of what they talk about. And a lot of this work could be very descriptive, right? You could kind of, through community detection, you can maybe identify these different communities. And then you can kind of explore, like, okay, well, let's even just visually map out the behaviors of the individuals in these clusters to see if we see any noticeable trends. Alternatively, with a network of keywords connected by their co-occurrence in the same post, we can see how topics start to emerge and intersect with one another. So this is much more exploratory than the previous aim, but I think it could yield some really interesting things. And then the final part is to kind of take the output from the latent semantic analysis and kind of by profiling individuals, we can use variations of that output to kind of see how communication style relates to the prevention engagement behaviors. And this would be like a standard.
And if you go back to the previous slide,
Mm-hmm.
so I'm looking at, if you were to overlay the individual data and then the word data, so how do you account for like the strength of ties? So for example, if you're friends with this other person for a very long time, and then you have new networks that form, and then you have sort of like acquaintance and not really interacting on a day-to-day basis. And sometimes the strength of weak ties is that if you haven't heard from that person for a long time and then they post something, you're counterintuitively more likely to react to that rather than someone who you talk on a day-to-day basis. So how do you account for, so in terms of HIV-related behaviors, how that could influence, so the strength of ties?
So I think, the simplest way to think about that could be if you have, and I think we can get this from our data, is frequency of interaction. So if for example, we're looking at the Facebook friendship network, what does a Facebook friendship tie even mean? Because we know that they're formed really easily and they rarely dissolve unless something really big happens in the lives of these kids. Like, you just kind of keep them around. So we've actually, our team at Chicago we talk about this a lot. Like, how can we come up with a slightly better measure of connectivity? You can kind of imagine utilizing both, like just taking these kind of different networks that exist in Facebook and trying to kind of aggregate them to say, like, okay, they're Facebook friends, they also belong to the same group, and they do X, right? And so you can kind of have some kind of weight that you can apply, which you can do in either ergoms, but you can do a variety of things with network analysis. Or you can imagine taking some of the semantic stuff and being like, well, they have a friendship tie, and they also, even if we're not looking at their actual like direct exchanges, we know that they talk similarly, like they have a similar, and maybe that makes their relationship stronger. So off the top of my head, it's those kinds of things that you can do. It's almost like an aggregating, like, and there are ways that you can kind of, and I think certainly if you have information about how frequently they communicate with one another, like they share information on each other's timelines. Okay, so let's just quickly get through the last aim, which is building this predictive model. So, when we think about big data in health research, most of us think about kind of the use of electronic medical records, because that is kind of the big thing right now. So what I'm doing is kind of suggesting that social media can potentially supplement some of that information. And big data, are typically these kinds of studies that use kind of EMRs are typically used to kind of, we have all of this like kind of medical data about an individual, and then we try to pull from that to kind of predict people who might be at risk for potential diseases, retention in care, likelihood of readmission to hospital, or whatever. But my question is what can electronic medical records actually tell us about kind of these social and cultural variables that we know are related to prevention engagement, right? And risk engagement. So things like peer networks, social engagement, experiences with stigma and discrimination, et cetera. I don't think electronic medical records can really tell us anything about those kinds of things. And further, what can EMRs tell us about someone who has very little healthcare engagement in the first place, right? There might not actually be a lot there, and especially with the population that I work with, they're marginalized from the healthcare system. So, a lot of them have very little reason, unless something serious happens, to have gone to a doctor, things like that. So instead, I propose that social media may offer us a window into some of these more social and cultural life features. that we know are related to HIV prevention, and kind of fill in those gaps where there's a dearth of health information for groups, for individuals who are already marginalized. So the goal of this portion is simply to, not simply, it's not simple, is to see whether features of social media use, so who they're connected to, the structure of their relationships, all these things that I've already been kind of talking about, patterns of communication, and kind of more macro level engagement patterns, like how often they post and things like that, whether those features can enhance our predictions of who might be at risk for HIV, or more particularly to what I'm interested in is, their risk of falling out of, their risk of not being retained in care. Above what we can do with the EMR data. I mean, we're not going to ignore the EMR data, but maybe it can kind of improve the model performance. So I'm not going to go into incredible detail, but what I'm proposing doing is to use kind of a machine learning approach for predictive modeling, something like decision trees or random forests, which would allow me kind of to develop this kind of classification system that predicts future observations, so like retention and prep care, for example. So this is just a real, kind of a stupid, silly example of what this would be doing, but it kind of is taking three or four features of Facebook engagement, so talking about sexual health on Facebook timeline, mentioning PrEP on the timeline, being a member of an LGBTQ identity group, having Facebook friends who post about PrEP, all with the idea that utilizing these rules can determine whether someone might be retained in care or not. This is obviously incredibly oversimplistic. But the features that we would include in the model would be all that Facebook stuff on top of EMR data and on top of other things that we've collected from the surveys, right? And so that is the goal of the final, that is the portion of the final aim. So, it's 3 o'clock. I am not going to do the future directions, and I just want to say thank you for giving me this opportunity, and if there's any questions, I can hang around for a little bit, but I thank you for your time, and I really appreciate
it. Questions?
No, sorry, Steve.
Go ahead.
I'll ask a quick one. Really great talk. I'm going to say interesting work. With social media, it seems like the challenge, too, is the lingo constantly changes.
Yep.
Because I remember just doing a HRSA survey not that long ago, and people said, well, nobody uses those drug terms anymore. And that thought we were pretty up to date on drug terms, and that's just on the drug terms. So thinking about all the lingo around, sex and other things, and just keeping up with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's the fact that it changes, and the fact that it's also very different. You can't even really say, I'm not convinced that we can take two different young Black MSM populations from two different cities, and I think we'll find slightly different things in terms of the words that they use. So there is this problem of like the generalizability. I have stopped caring about generalizability because all of my work thus far, although I'm definitely looking to expand outside of Chicago, has been kind of this very specific population. And I think where a lot of the work is turning is to better understand these within group heterogeneity, and just to better understand that group. But this definitely came up even in the interviews that I was doing when I was asking them specifically like drug terms, right? And it came up. They had someone was like kind of listing a bunch of things. Some of them I had heard of, some of them I hadn't, but they'd been confirmed by a couple other participants. And then he was like, oh, and then there's this new word that I suddenly heard, juns. They're using it for its pot, but like, he's like, yeah, I barely knew what it was. I had to look it up, or I had to ask someone what they were talking about. So I think that they're even noticing that there's always kind of these new words. So I think I don't know how exactly we're going to deal with that. I mean, I don't know how rapidly it's changing, so it's possible that like I might be working with a short enough window of time that I can kind of capture something. But could I come back to that same dictionary 2 years later? Probably not. I mean, I think I'd have to revisit it, definitely. Yeah.
A couple questions. Mm-hmm. So, great presentation. So one of the things about people is that they're fairly stable in their social behavior.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So does that translate into stability in social media? Do people Like, are you promiscuous in social media in terms of having a large social network that has a lot of ties going on as you might be in real life? Or is that something that's so different that we really don't know?
To be honest, this is a question that we think about a lot, and I think a lot of other people who are kind of working in this space, we get this a lot from reviewers. Is this like, well, how does this correspond to what we traditionally know about offline networks, or what has already been studied? So first, there's not a lot of studies that have actually tried to compare. There's been a few that have looked at like the structural dimensions of networks. So I think there was a study, and I can't remember the authors, but they had a very large, maybe a Facebook network, and then they also they had like probably of adolescents, and it was probably collected in schools because they also had offline friendships. So they were able to collect that like a full network of friendships in the school or within a grade level, and then they had Facebook or MySpace, and I'm not sure how old the paper was, and they found similar structural properties. Like, so they found that these networks, I think there was like a core and a periphery, and that's useful to some degree. I think there's maybe been one or two that have like done like the overlap, like to what extent are your friends offline that you're friends with on Facebook. I think anecdotally we're all pretty sure and certain, based on our own experiences, that most of the people that we're friends with on Facebook we also know personally. That's typically, I think in the beginning there was this notion that it was like a whole different world, and it might be the case for other social media platforms, but for Facebook it's primarily helping you connect to people you already know. And studies have been done just of taking your data and doing like community detection, and it basically is like, high school friends, work friends, college friends, some summer camp I went to, whatever. So it kind of typically is like that. But this is a really fruitful area of research, actually. To what extent do they overlap, and does it matter? And can you take, if they do overlap, then maybe we can stop collecting offline data, and we can just do the social media data, and that will have tractability in an offline world. I actually don't think that that's necessarily the case. And I actually don't really care, because social media is relevant. I hate it personally, but like, they're on it, And so if anything, it's a new space that we need to explore, and we need to use at least exploring it to better understand the things that they're dealing with in their lives. There's lots of opportunity for kind of near real-time interventions that could be done if you really think creatively about being able to kind of detect when someone is starting to kind of talk about being depressed, that you can imagine. And I think Ian Holloway is doing some really interesting work in this area, where he's trying to kind of think about how can we do this in some kind of near real time, where we could do like a really mini intervention with that person when we start seeing certain patterns in the way that they talk on Facebook. So to me, it's like, anecdotally, I think there's a lot of crossover, with my guys. There's definitely a lot of crossover, but it's a unique space in its own right.
Echoing the really positive feedback about your talk, we learned a lot from what you presented, and yet I'm struggling because there's always this concern about coming to the conclusion that everything is related to everything.
Right, of course.
And maybe challenging you on some of the things that you said, that you don't care about generalizability. It seems like you care about wanting to generalize, not maybe from Chicago to LA. Maybe they use different language, but maybe that there might be some similar structures, similar patterns. And I guess that, I don't know, I guess when I think about complex phenomena, HIV-related care behavior or radicalization of people, it seems like it almost inherently is going to depend on high-order interactions that are not going to be very easy to pinpoint in this kind of way. So like some of these predictive modeling approaches, you might be able to see broad trends, but you might as well start out by not anticipating that you're going to be able to pinpoint who's about to commit suicide or who's about to do something
No, I agree, especially with the predictive modeling. It is kind of an everything in the kitchen sink, and you tend to get like everything significant, or you're not, you can do all these fancy interactions, but like, what does it really mean? Because like when you boils down to it, maybe they're not being retained in care because like they don't have a direct bus line to the to the clinic. So I don't know how to. So the one thing I can say, I mean, these are all very, very real things that we need to kind of think about. I guess what I was thinking when I kind of said I don't care about generalizability, it's more like I don't necessarily think that if I find significant clustering of, individuals who engage in condomless sex, and we find that they all tend to be friends together, and they all belong to the same Facebook group. So there's a real kind of community that's emerging, and I find that in my data. I would not expect necessarily to see that happening in a similar network of guys from LA, for example. I think where the generalizability comes in for me, and what I'm kind of not concerned about, but interested in kind of at least promoting, is the generalizability of the method. So, as a networks person in this community, I mean, networks are becoming very popular and it's a thing, but we still often find ourselves in the position of having to kind of defend. And I skipped over all those slides that had practically why is this even relevant and important. And the points that I made there was just getting at like why this method could be reapplied in these different settings. So you can collect a different network and maybe do similar analyses to at least find, well, what kinds of people in these networks cluster, or which types are more likely to kind of join these types of groups. So it's not so much, I don't expect the generalizability in the finding, I just want to kind of promote kind of the general application of the technique, I guess. But I do agree with you with the danger of the predictive models and how much you put in. I mean, I think with that aim, it was kind of like just the natural progression based on all the content that I had. And I think it would be interesting to be able to see if social media could fill in some of those gaps that EMRs can't get to. I mean, so much of what I think we're doing, I mean, my background is I'm a social scientist and a network methodologist. I don't come from a public health background. So I'm more interested in these social and cultural things, and I think this is, I mean, at least with our guys' anecdote, I mean, we're finding that these things are actually quite relevant and significant in when we can model them, and health data, while cool that we can get all this stuff, it's often very messy, and it's only one type of factor that influences decisions to be in care, or stay in care, to even get tested, whatever.
I think what you just enunciated, saying that there's apt to be information here that goes beyond what gets routinely recorded in electronic health records. I think that's and then any body of significant
exactly.
variation.
It just goes up a little bit. It's an improvement.
Well, it's valuable.
It is. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could say a bit more about the information you get on the groups, primarily because I'm wondering about privacy concerns for information you find out about people who are not your participants.
Yeah.
Like, can you see who the members of the groups are, or even, would people be concerned that you even know about the existence of a secret group?
Yeah, so public groups, so with the groups, we only get the names, and we have, it's a painstaking effort to then go through and get, for that study that I did where I actually looked, we were looking at, it was a smaller sample, it was about, ultimately we coded about 600 groups, but then I think the actual network itself, we parsed it down to a more meaningful set of groups that we had enough participants belonging to. And what we had available to us was just the description of the group and the name of the group. We, in the files that we're using for analysis, did not have any access to the other individuals who were in the group or what they were posting about. Now, that being said, for the public groups that were searchable, you could go on Facebook, and look, and if they're a public group, you can see the posts. But that's the danger of being a public group. I mean, you choose that, and it becomes available to the public. But then you kind of get to another issue, which is the third-party issue, right? So how do you protect the privacy of people who have not consented to be in the study? And then that goes back to this IRB relationship. So because we've been doing this for a couple of studies now, and we haven't had any major issues once we kind of worked through the first process, the first study that did this. You just have to go through a lot of steps of ensuring that like, for example, we get all of the Facebook friends names from each person. That data at first step out of the download, is de-identified. So everyone gets, a numeric number, and you use those numeric numbers to then be able to match across participants, right? So we want to know if you and I share a common friend, right? But we don't use names. Obviously, data storage is a big thing. We don't, with the manual download, you do not have access to a third party's account. So it's not like you can go and then see their data, like on their Facebook account. And that's something there may have been some issues with that when third-party apps were allowed and you were scraping data. You could probably accidentally may have been getting that information. But with the download, you're just getting their username. So that helps to be able to say we're not getting any of their data. Like, we don't know anything about them. And then just, de-identification, making sure that only, all the typical things that you're kind of used to in persuading your IRB officers that you're going to protect this data. But it takes, it's having that IRB program officer who understands your work and is going to be your advocate. And we're fortunate enough to kind of have had that at Chicago. All right.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.